So good morning everyone, you're very welcome to our first ever Samhain event in Sligo, in the Yeats Society, in the Yeats building indeed, right in the heart of Sligo town. Some people may not know that William Butler Yeats actually had a publication called Samhain, and so we stole our design for the programme from that front cover. And of course, William Butler Yeats was a man of many parts. And as some of you will know, we were watching and listening last night to Professor Susan Johnston-Graf talking about his lifelong interest in and study of magic and how important that was to him in his life. It was the twin pillar of his life along with his poetry. So we thought that it was an appropriate time of year to try to explore a little bit about darkness and the occult and the moon. And we have a performance this evening called Moon Bathing, which again is an acknowledgement of his interest in the lunar cycle and all that meant to him and what it meant to his life. So I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Dr. Robert Hensey. Robert is first and foremost an archaeologist, and one of the things that piqued his interest many moons ago was watching people and understanding and learning about people who were interested in going into dark tomb spaces, places like Carramore and Newgrange. And what was it that drew them into that darkness? Were they going on a journey for themselves, or were they merely just trying to discover what had happened before them? He is a man of many parts, and so he wrote a book called The Archaeology of Darkness as a result of that interest as it first arose. And now one of the things that he's involved with very heavily here is the chair of the Sligo Neolithic Landscapes. And while that may not immediately mean a lot to some people, it is of course also part of his work is to try to ensure that UNESCO would qualify our skies here as dark with the qualification of dark skies. And those of us lucky enough to live in Sligo will appreciate if that's happening. And if that does happen, a lot of it will be down to Robert and his colleagues for making the effort to make that occur. So he's also been involved with running a conference called Into the Earth. And I asked Robert very specifically today to offer us a wide-ranging view, that he wasn't tied down to any aspect of his own interests or his own work, that he choose himself what he would like to share with us. So it'll be a smorgasbord of delight, and I'm very pleased to welcome Robert this morning to the Yeats building, and I trust we will enjoy. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end, or indeed perhaps as we go along, depending on how it's going. But certainly please think of that too. So I hand over to Robert.
Thanks very much. So, hello everyone, and hello to anyone who's joining us by video as well. Very happy to have you here. As regards the World Heritage, Susan just mentioned, we are looking very much at the landscapes here in Sligo and the Neolithic monuments here in particular, the passage tombs. And part of our aim is that they would be protected and preserved into the future and recognised for how important they are. So there's been a lot of work gone on for the last year or two, and we're just one of a number of sites that are hoping to get placed on Ireland's World Heritage tentative list. So it's like a kind of panel that the state will choose sites from and put them forward to be World Heritage sites, put them forward to UNESCO. So hopefully we'll hear something about that in the next few weeks or before the end of the year. So it's an exciting time. So before I begin, just to thank, of course, Susan again and the Yeats Society for the kind invite to come and speak. And on this bright October morning, I'm going to speak about darkness and its role in our past. About how darkness is a central characteristic of the human experience, and really a fundamental aspect of our human story over time. I'll speak about how people have sought out darkness through time and the relationship between darkness and occult knowledge. So, but if I may, I'm going to begin with 3 caveats. I don't want to get too legalistic on you at this hour of the morning. But the first, I'd say, is the meaning and roots of the word occult, or the occult. When you look into the origins of the word, it's synonymous with other words like hidden, secret, clandestine, concealed, or covered up. And over time, perhaps a lot more has become attached to that word. And for many people today, it's seen as simply as the paranormal. The cult equals paranormal. And that particularly was associated with groups in the mid-19th century, the Theosophists, Rosicrucians, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and of course all of these groups that W.B. Yeats had very close affinities with. But it's the broader meaning, that of hiddenness, that I will primarily be talking about today. So in that context, there are 2 activities which are really at the heart of this talk. The first is the action of secreting objects into another world through darkness. What is usually referred to depositions or offerings in archaeological or anthropological literature. The second act, conversely, is of retrieving the hidden, especially hidden knowledge, by voluntarily going into darkness and dark places for extended periods, away from one's community and away from the conventional, the daylight world, away from consensus reality. And I think after the last 20 months, we've all had to, nobody would object to avoiding consensus reality for a little while. So a second caveat, darkness, of course, can refer to a great many things. It can be the dark of the night, the darkness of deep winter, the darkness of the subterranean world, and even interior darkness. Dark and light are, of course, very powerful metaphors that we all live by, and our sort of language and our thought is infused by them. As the subject is so very broad and can be difficult to treat, this talk, as Susan said, will likewise range very far and wide. After this introduction, I will look at various aspects of darkness through the archaeological record, beginning in the Paleolithic period. I will spend a good bit of time in the middle of the talk talking about the Neolithic period, megalithic monuments, those dark chambers, and partly because that's my particular area of study, but not just that. It's those monuments actually tell us an awful lot about how people in the past thought about light and dark. And they're sort of the key to understanding the area in one sense. And then finally, at the end of the talk, I'm going to move to people who intentionally went into darkness in search of the hidden. So a final caveat. It's important to keep in mind that people's relationship with the dark varies across cultures. So for instance, in Japan, there'd be a very different understanding of darkness and its qualities, how it's used in a building, whether it's positive or negative, and so on. Even within a particular culture or region, the subject of darkness has changed over time, or how people view the dark. So in our case, for instance, we can say that for 300 years we've gradually been lighting up our world, especially over the last century. In Evening's Empire, A History of the Night in Early Modern Europe, Craig Kozlowski records perceptions of light and dark in European history over the course of what he calls our steady colonization of the night. He details the dramatic changes in the lives of European city inhabitants that came with the introduction of street lighting from the 18th century onwards. In particular, a kind of pacifying effect that light had on cities. So people began to see the night in a more positive way, essentially. It was now safer to go out at night. Deviant behaviors had less place to hide. And the kind of seeming threat of darkness was being driven back by these lights. And of course today, it's probably hard for any of us to imagine a city without light. I was in Achill Island there just over the summer, and I was at Keem Bay and Purcheen Harbour, and you could see there, signs of so many basking sharks that were caught there, thousands over many decades. And of course, the oil was taken from the liver of these sharks and used to light cities all over, Britain, all over Ireland. So that was our way for some time, and then came electricity. Very elderly Irish people still talk with great enthusiasm about the time of the rural electrification scheme in Ireland of the late 1940s and the many benefits it brought to their lives. But over time, electrification may have brought one or two less positive changes as well. And I remember the late John Moriarty. Susan, I don't know if you remember John speaking here some years ago, but he came here and spoke here. But he would have talked about a subtle loss of perception that happened with this change to electrification. It's now estimated that 2/3 of Europeans no longer experience what's referred to as real night, the deeper levels of dark skies. Most of the world's population are no longer able to see the Milky Way, for instance. This is so much the case that we found it necessary to create dark sky preserves. So a 700 square kilometre area in County Kerry was the first gold-tier international dark sky preserve in the Northern Hemisphere, I believe. And it's one of only 4 such examples in the world. This process of driving out the dark has continued to a point whereby we now have almost a complete ability to exclude darkness from our everyday lives. And I'm sure all of us have had the experience of being on devices late at night and staying up much longer than we planned. Yet, even with considerable darkness in our lives, we still spend time in darkness. About 1/3 of our existences are spent in the darkness of sleep, for instance. As we turn further back in time, darkness and dark places would have had a far greater currency in our lives. We need only reflect on the Paleolithic cave art in southern France and northern Spain and elsewhere, including lesser-known places like Germany, Italy, even England, to realize that dark places always held a certain allure for humankind and played an important role in the human story. Figurative and non-figurative art in the deep caves of Western Europe appeared sometime around, or maybe a little bit before, 40,000 years ago. And you can see there, the man blowing coloured pigment onto his hands, and what's left behind is these kind of famous handprints. The earliest examples of cave art consisted of finger dots, these kind of hand stencils, and simple animal outlines. And these are more often found in rock shelters. But over time, the art is increasingly found in deep and deeper caves, and the designs become more compositional, such as the famous polychrome paintings of Lascaux and Altamira. When we think about the past, we automatically tend to think about certain daylight activities, such as food procurement or construction of shelters or other buildings, temples, and so on. But many equally necessary activities would have taken place in the dark of the subterranean world. For instance, mining for stone tools and metals. Vast subterranean quarries such as Grimes Graves in Norfolk in Britain are a case in point. There, people in the final Neolithic and early Bronze Age spent considerable amounts of time under the ground in shadowy tunnels and chambers, sourcing flint, almost to an industrial scale. So to give you a sense of the size of this, the site extends over about 97 acres, and one of the shafts is 14 meters deep. You can see a little representation there in the top left. Megalithic art, of course, would have been carved and viewed in a situation of limited light. Today, our archaeologically exact recording of art inside megalithic tombs, laying bare every incision and peck mark, betrays the actual experience of somebody going into one of these decorated monuments. Of course, many of the motifs would have been shrouded in darkness. Somebody in the Neolithic, for instance, not having the advantage of our books and recordings of all of these motifs, would have missed many of the less prominent or badly lit carvings. Conversely, some others would have really stood out and been seen much more significant, perhaps left a more lasting impression. So when we remove darkness from the equation, we remove something of the experience of a place. Many objects, of course, were intentionally deposited in places that exclude light. Not only caves and megalithic monuments, but also underneath various mounds and barrows, in stone-lined kists, in pits, in bogs, and countless other dark locations and site types, or just simply buried directly into the earth. You can see images of several types of these sites here. So we can see a fascination with darkness archaeologically through these countless ritual depositions and offerings made over time in darkened monuments. It's easily forgotten that darkness is a key aspect of deposition, that the item is being removed from this world, placed into darkness, into a hidden reality. So we're a little bit closer to home here at Carrickeel, and even here you can see this desire still continues actually today for people to make offerings in dark places, prehistoric or other archaeological sites. So on the top right here you can see a ring that I photographed in one of the Carrickeel Passage tombs some years ago, and we don't know, but I imagine it was worn by somebody deceased, with their partner or something brought the ring up to the monument. Or perhaps it was evidence of a divorce, I don't know. We do find sometimes modern cremations as well at these sites, which is an unusual phenomenon. And of course these are terribly confusing for archaeologists of the future, because you're going to have this mix of modern and ancient cremated bone. Many of the objects are the kind of things that you would expect to find, candles, in the bottom middle there, special or unusual stones that people are bringing with them to the site. On the right there you can see actually a whole box of incense that somebody's left behind. And then you get sometimes more unusual or more exotic things. So we've seen a statue of a Cretan goddess, for instance, in one of the tombs. Perhaps the most weird I've ever seen was that on one occasion I went up early one day, and outside every tomb there was sweets left just at the entrance to the tomb, these little jelly babies you can see in the bottom left. And I think in my career as an archaeologist, it's the closest I've got to a human sacrifice. These little jelly babies. On a more serious note, the process of removing physical things from this reality can also be applied to human bodies too. Burial in the earth is, of course, one of the most common ways to deal with the dead in many cultures around the world. The remains removed to another dimension, to another plane. And this is an example I came across some years ago, a book about burial traditions in Greece in the 1970s. And what happened in those societies was when somebody died that there would be great mourning and the person would be buried. And then about a year later, as in this photo, a group would come back. It was always the women of the community would come back to the grave, and they would open the grave and they would examine the bones. And they would look at the soft tissue of the bones and see whether it had decomposed. And of course, if it hadn't decomposed, the conclusion was that the person still had some sins that hadn't been cleansed. And down the bones go again, the grave is covered up. And again, they would come back again a year later. And hopefully at that point, all of the flesh had decomposed off the body and the soft tissues. And the person was considered somehow purified. And at that point, they would take the bones out, as they're doing here, and they would go in the communal ossuary. So at that point, they were part of a kind of purified ancestry, or, they could join the ancestors who guided the community, maybe. The ground in this case was a kind of physical purgatory, a separate realm in darkness where metaphysical processes could occur. And that's really sort of a common theme when you're talking about the earth and going underneath the earth. Various lands of the dead, such as the Greek Hades, are associated with darkness and night. Notably, such underworlds are often identified with caves, swallow holes, and other entrances into the earth. It may be significant that most living things, in particular vegetation, stop at these thresholds. This may have struck people in the past as a sign of the meaning of these places. Connections with life and death lend a theatrical power to darkness, which may have been harnessed in past myth, and perhaps best exemplified in the Greek myth of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, and the abduction of her daughter Persephone to the underworld. The underworld can seem threatening, yet darkness can equally be protective and nourishing, the dark, safe womb, the life-giving earth where seeds germinate and from whence life springs forth. And this aspect of the story is represented by Persephone returning from the underworld to our world in the form of plant growth in spring. And you can see in the image there, just on the right, she's sort of emerging from a little cave or emerging from under the ground. John Waddell has focused on the myth of the nocturnal journey of the sun and how it is displayed in the archaeological record. He notes that a solar boat drawn by horses or birds is a remarkably widespread image in later continental prehistory, extending in various forms from Scandinavia to southeastern Europe, so over the whole of the continent essentially. In the past, people would of course naturally ask, where did the sun go? You know, they would see it at sunset, this fiery orb descending down into the sea. And then what happened after that? The answer invariably was that it travelled under the earth, through the darkness, only to reappear on the eastern horizon the next morning. This may be one reason the dark netherworld is seen as a place of generation in many world traditions and myths. Danish archaeologist Flemming Kohl has investigated this story of the nocturnal sun through extensive Bronze Age Scandinavian excavations. And on the top left here, you can see the gilded face of this sun disk. And notice it's been pulled by a horse, and it's been pulled from left to right. And that's the sun going through its journey in the day. But if you look at the piece on the bottom then, the bottom left, the horse is going the other direction. So you're going from right to left. That means you're going under the earth is what was discovered. And of course, this side wasn't gilded. So the sun's journey right to left and then left to right underneath the earth. Again, in the top right here, you can see images of a bronze razor from South Jutland. And you can see a solar boat, and there's some people in the boat. And they seem to have sun-like heads, and it's been suggested that these could be solar deities. Again, they're traveling from left to right. Like the other image there, that's the journey of the sun during the day. But on the bottom, you can see the image, the boat now, it also has a horse head at the front, being chased by a fish, and it's moving through the underworld, through the darkness. It's unlikely that all the symbolism of these artifacts will ever be understood, but we could say, you know, people in the past had a deep interest in what takes place at night, in the dark, and expressed in these kind of objects. Closer to home, it goes without saying that in the Northern Hemisphere, the winter itself is synonymous with darkness. As we all know at this time of year, is associated with the Hauna, Halloween, or sometimes called the Innisfrigina. And traditions and customs of this festival revolve around the belief that it was this night that the spirits, including departed loved ones, could return, or that spiritual traffic, if you like, could move in either direction. I'm sure you'll remember candles being placed in the windows of houses to guide the spirits into the house. And I remember as a child seeing this in my own kind of rural house, and the candles in the window, and like looking out the window for hours. There was a dark road beneath our house, and fully believing and imagining that there were spirits moving along the road and that someone could come in to visit. The late and great Sean O'Dean, you may know the Benedictine scholar from Glenstall, he discussed the Halloween tradition of children dressing up as ghouls or monsters, now Americanized really as trick-or-treating, as a symbolic representation of the Tuatha Dé Danann and the ancient gods returning to farms to exact a tribute. It was they that had provided the harvest during the year, and they had essentially come to take their tithe. And of course, people would have understood that it was the gods that had put the fertility into the land, had put the milk in the cattle, the river full of fish, and so on. And now they were demanding compensation or perhaps retribution. And the trick in this case would be a bad harvest or bad luck in the following year if the tribute was not made. Magico-religious beliefs centered on the earth and the harvest must have been very strong in the consciousness of the very first farmers in Ireland. And these come in the Neolithic period, and they build the megalithic monuments like Carrickeel we've already mentioned, or Carramore nearby here. Their lives depended on what happened to the seeds they planted in the darkness beneath their feet. Connections between darkness, birth, and regeneration may have taken on additional resonances in the kind of religious rituals that they performed at this time as well. How was the earth conceived in this context? Was it regarded as a separate world, a powerful dimension with the ability to give and perhaps to take life? Evidence for a belief system that perceived the earth to be a powerful and fecund alternative dimension of reality can be observed in the examination of the widespread evidence of ceremonial subterranean deposition in this period. Could this be why axe heads are often deposited, even sometimes separately, or sometimes you get big groups of them deposited into the earth? Mines and quarries, you'll find they're not just functional places, but they're kind of religious places. You'll find something equivalent to altars there, or some kind of ritual deposition. Even the fragments left over when these people were making stone tools, sometimes they rebury them into the earth. So again, why were they doing this? These types of activities are indicative of beliefs that see the earth as a source of life and entrances into that dark subterranean world as sacred. There's a lovely painting here by Fergus Lyons, you may know, again, local painter. And recently he's painted a lot of these megalithic tombs. You can see a couple in the image there. The construction of megalithic tombs at elevated location may have been seen as a way to house spirits and forces perceived to be expelled from the landscape through farming and the removal of forest. And you must remember when farming came, there had been people on this island here for thousands of years. And with the introduction of farming, enormous changes in the landscape. Whole swathes of forest, primeval old growth forests that have been there for so long, would have been removed very quickly. And other dramatic things like, a great hill like Knocknarea deciding to put a 30,000-ton monument on it, it would have been utterly kind of shocking experience. So rites of initiation whereby younger members of the tribe were introduced to these guiding powers, now seen to be resident in passage tombs, would be one way of ensuring that the vital relationships between these life-giving powers and the human community would flourish. Those who went into the realm and perhaps stayed for extended periods may have been compared with seeds within the darkened earth, or perceived to be undergoing some kind of transformation as do seeds. Light and dark were central to the construction of chamber tombs. In Ireland today, when we think about light and dark in the past, our minds turn to these kind of chamber tombs, and particularly places like Newgrange. And this phenomena of the light coming into Newgrange on the winter solstice has almost become an unofficial national emblem at this point. I don't know, has anybody seen the streaming that we do every winter solstice? This lovely image here is by Ken Williams, a fabulous photographer, and actually several of the images, including the one at the start and at the beginning of the presentation, are from Ken's. But we don't often see a site like this in starlight or at night, but it would have been a very important aspect of a site like Newgrange. Even today, and myself and others would gather at the front of the monument every winter solstice and stand there, usually shivering in the cold and the dark for several hours, waiting for the sun to come up on the horizon. And of course, it shines up on the quartz at the front of the building. It's quite dramatic. Then, as now, the full experience was never intended for everyone gathered. Due to the limited size of the chamber, very few people would actually have been able to enter the structure and to witness the beautiful phenomena of the light coming into the monument. Most would have gathered outside the monument at dawn and waited in darkness. And you might imagine people travelling actually to come to the event. So they may have been in nearby settlements and travelling through the dark. But other people could have travelled from other parts of the region or even from the country. Some of the more recent evidence from the Boyne Valley is suggesting people even came from off the island. That these were, even beyond national kind of pilgrimage places. So people are moving in the dark and maybe arriving at these places at night for these, stunning seasonal celebrations. One aspect of gatherings at the darkest time of the year may have been facing fears and insecurities. Some years ago, I heard a radio interview with the psychologist Maureen Gaffney. She was actually on the radio this morning. Again, funnily, I heard her. But she was speaking about holidaying somewhere on the continent, I think it was in Switzerland, and the electricity went. And she said she experienced a type of darkness, a kind of intensity of darkness she'd never known in her life before. And of course, presumably quite cold as well. And it sort of got her to thinking, whether these kind of seasonal celebrations at Christmas may have had deeper roots in ancient gatherings at the darkest point of the year, at the winter solstice. And what she suggested is they may have served as a kind of unconscious audit of one's friends and alliances. As one was facing into this really tough time, this very cold time, most people, of course, would have died during this time, you wanted to see who was with you, and it may have been at these kind of prehistoric sites that, alliances were formed, these kind of tribal gatherings were a point of these festivals and some of these monuments. So darkness is a complicated thing. It brings us into very difficult territory, into chaos, kind of away from rationality, away from reason. By its very nature, it seems to repel objectification and to actively resist study. You cannot photograph the dark, for instance. When we see images of deep caves or megalithic recesses, we can only do so because of camera flashes and other artificial means of lighting. We're photographing the light, not the dark, really. That's a torch in my hand, not a lightsaber, in case anybody's thinking I have special powers. Stories from the Boyne Valley show how the medieval Irish understood the complexity and paradoxes of darkness and light. In the tale, The Taking of the Otherworld Mound, and also in the wooing of Eton, a young Angus, the god Angus, wins Newgrange from its owner, the Dagda, by a conceptual ruse. He argues for possession of the monument for a day and a night. And when the owner comes to claim the site back, he explains the world is composed of days and nights, concluding that his ownership should be made permanent. A Dinshenicus tale relates to the construction and naming of this site nearby, Doubt. It's one of the largest of these enormous mega monuments in the Boyne Valley. And the name comes from the Gaelic dua, or darkness. In this story, the daughter of the mound's owner makes the sun stand still so that the day is lengthened, and hence the construction work could be completed more quickly. An illicit sexual union takes place, breaking taboos and thus giving the site its name. The protagonist of the story tells us, "And since our work has been darkened, roll dua upon us, and night has come, and day has departed, let each go to his own place. Dua, darkening, will be the name of this place forever." In that instance, darkness had negative connotations, but this is not typically the case in the Irish tradition, especially when wisdom is the topic. John Carey, the great scholar from UCC, explains how everything is reversed when we speak about wisdom in the ancient Irish tradition. Darkness is light, and light is darkness. He notes, what we experience as vision, as the unreflective, unproblematical world of daylight, appears to the people of the Sidhe as darkness. We are the walking blind. We can only escape from our blindness by turning our backs on the only night we know. So hence the only way out of darkness leads us directly into darkness. He continues by noting a curious scene from the wooing of Eton, where a king, repeatedly thwarted in his attempts to dig up a Sidhe mound, is only successful when he leaves blind puppies and blind cats at the site of the digging. So a very kind of bizarre story, but gives you a little insight into how people viewed darkness. Accounts of the Gaelic poetic schools, though many of them written much later, still speak of how apprentice poets had rooms with no windows to let in the day, and describe how they would lie shut away from the light composing their verses. Like the blind, they too become intimate with darkness. And you see a very unusual little quote here, 1703. They shut their doors and windows for a day's time and lie on their backs with a stone upon their belly and plaids about their heads, and their eyes being covered, they pump their brains for rhetorical encomium or panegyric. And indeed they furnish such a style from this dark cell as is understood by very few. So you're getting into very mysterious kind of traditions here in Ireland. The relationship between darkness, blindness, and wisdom in the Irish tradition is a challenging subject, and one that we can only touch on here. Suffice it to say, blind musicians such as Turlough O'Carolan, blind poets, people like Seamus Dowell McCourta, or the O'Raftery, the poet, last of the wandering bards, loom large in the artistic history of this island. Perhaps one of the most arresting, yet, we're moving to something relatively modern now, examples of drama and the transformative power of darkness is the confession box. There participants believe that a cleansed soul can be achieved by entering and passing through this particular type of ritual darkness. The hard wooden kneeling bench of the confessional compartment seemingly the only anchor in the pitch darkness. For believers, darkness held a key to direct communication with the highest power. Counterintuitively, nothing could remain hidden in darkness, no act or transgression. Yeats also saw darkness as a gateway to insight, to illumination. In a preface to a collection of short stories from 1897, I think dedicated to AE, he noted that in Ireland in particular, no shining candelabra have prevented us from looking into the darkness. And when one looks into the darkness, there is always something there. He probably wouldn't have been in love with rural electrification, I think we can say. In this he may have been echoing Milton and the famous phrase from Milton, "Yet from these flames no light, but rather darkness visible." Similarly, in Wendell Berry's poem, "To Know the Dark," he writes, "To go into the dark with a light is to know the light, and only the light. To know the dark, go without sight." So in this final section of the talk now, I'm going to turn to people who took that as their mission, to go into the dark. I'm largely going to be based on Buddhist and Christian traditions, and partly that's because we have good records in that case, and also details about why people were choosing to go into caves or to spend large periods of their lives secluded in total darkness. So in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, periods of darkness and retreat in darkness typically lasted for 49 days, and they've been part of the religious tradition there since at least the 15th century. They even had a specific name. It was called the Yangti Nakpo, or the Black Quintessence Retreat. In this instance, the specific value of the surrounding darkness was to allow one to better achieve the mental visualizations necessary to particular meditation practices without outward visual distraction. And again, I'm sure, this is something Yeats, again, would have appreciated. The great 14th century philosopher and meditation master Tsongkhapa is recorded having spent a 6-month retreat in total darkness. A 19th century female retreatant from the Tibetan tradition, Ayu Khandru, is reputed to have intermittently spent several decades in a cave in dark retreat. And I've heard in that case what they would do is, around the time the practitioner was due to leave, people on the outside would be alerted, and there would be a seal of some kind of cloth or something over the cave, and a little pinprick would be put into the seal. So you'd have this tiny little, like a miniature Newgrange, a tiny little beam of light would beam in. And of course the idea was that the person could gradually get used to this, the shock of coming into the light. It would be too much to come directly out into the light. In some Tibetan Buddhist lineages, lucid sleep was a technique employed in special retreats. Advanced practitioners saw the malleable world of dreams as a suitable place to practice the insights into the nature of reality which were part of their tradition. In other cases, they would use retreats to perfect practices associated with death, in expectation that when their actual time of death came, that they could use these techniques to achieve enlightenment at that spiritually fertile moment. And these practices, of course, are still continued today. These are relatively common feature of that tradition. There were deeper darknesses of longer duration in the Christian tradition as well. In Christian hagiography, some saints, as I'm sure we all know, were recorded as having spent a considerable time in caves and retreat places, pursuing spiritual goals. And in this, they were following the lead of the desert fathers in Syria and in Egypt. And they're imagining their lush forests in Ireland as deserts, as spiritual deserts. Hermits were a common feature of the religious landscape in Ireland. Places like St. Kevin's Bed, which I'm sure you'll know, Susan, Skellig Michael and Inishmurray provide testament to the hermetical zeal of early Irish monasticism. Some retreatants, distinguished as anchorites or recluses, went even further and dedicated their whole lives to retreat. Again, anchorites still exist. Often their cells would be connected to churches. The last Italian anchoress, so you had a specific title for a female anchorite, an anchoress, died in Rome in 1990, and she had been 46 years in total seclusion. But these experiences were certainly not all peaceful. A site famed for its fearful journey into darkness is the cave-like structure known as St. Patrick's Purgatory, which once existed on one of the pilgrimage islands at Lough Derg, County Fermanagh, so just 60 kilometres north of us. The fame of this pilgrimage site was spread all over Europe in the late medieval period. It was thought to be an entry point into purgatory, a place where one could pass through the tortures awaiting one after death, but to do it in this life. And because you had done that, you would be sort of granted heavenly visions. The situation was imagined as somewhat akin to that of the confession box on steroids, you could say, amplified to a tremendous degree. In this experience, it was believed that the soul could be entirely cleansed, and of course, thereby angels and demons and so on would appear to the brave supplicant in this process. Before the retreatant entered the structure, a special rite was performed, and we know from recent scholarship it was called the rite of enclosure. So one of the elements of this involved a funeral-like ritual for the person undertaking the ordeal. Essentially, you were required to participate in your own funeral before you went in, so you can imagine how absolutely terrifying that may have been for some people. We know from records of an Italian merchant and pilgrim named Antonio Manini, who left his home in Florence, arriving at St. Patrick's Purgatory in the year 1411. This is a genuine account now. The man travelled on a horse across Europe to this small island, from his perspective, at the edge of the known world. He went to Armagh and got permission from the bishop to enter St. Patrick's Purgatory. He crossed harsh landscapes to arrive at a lake edge. He took a boat. He came to another island. The Augustinian priest tried to persuade him not to enter. Presumably the rite of entrance or enclosure was performed. And then he would have taken off his clothes and entered into what he believed was purgatory. So did he experience purgatory? Well, I suppose we can't say, or we don't know. Unusually for the time, he doesn't leave any record of visions or anything supernatural, and you can find so many accounts that are kind of very supernatural, so this is a kind of odd one. However, we can say that en route he left behind his family, his culture, his language, the supports which gave him an identity. He went to an island within an island, across water to cross water, into the earth, and presumably deeper and deeper into internal experience. Prolonged time in darkness, especially in isolation, often seems to involve a dissolution of our everyday identities, or perhaps the supporting ideas on which they are based, whether it's our family roles or our careers, our place in society, and so on. This type of spiritual catastrophe is sometimes referred to as the dark night in mystical literature. The poem, The Dark Night of the Soul, was penned by the Spanish 16th century Carmelite friar, St. John of the Cross. And in this case, the phrase dark night, it doesn't refer to sort of the trials of everyday life that we all have. Rather, it describes a very specific kind of experience that happens to one on, over a period of nights in the course of the kind of mystical journey. So as one progresses through these stages, it's a very particular and defined experience. But even at an ordinary level, some of these practices, this thing of decoupling yourself from the world for a long period, losing kind of worldly reference points would have been very challenging. In this outer vacuum, inner experience becomes heightened. So people describe actually not, we imagine that thing, our senses become duller, but in fact people describe heightened senses in these kind of contexts. In darkness, memory is encouraged. Outside influences and new memories are fewer. Darkness allows time to assimilate previous experience, and of course time that we rarely have nowadays. Darkness encourages a kind of processing. You could call it a kind of getting back to the start. And before birth, we all spend many months in the womb in darkness, growing and changing, transforming. And perhaps this explains why darkness appears to have such a profound effect on us. There's a great metaphorical resonance between this time before birth and what is replicated in dark and in isolation. So in conclusion, there are a great many aspects to darkness, and I've really just tried to touch on a few here this morning. What I've tried to show in this talk is that the occult, the hidden, is evidence across the human past and often associated with darkness and activities in dark places. The darkness of night and shadow is intimately connected with human evolution through our experience of the seasons and dark landscape, but also through activities beneath the Earth's surface. One could even include our desire to understand and travel into outer space as part of the same impulse, to discover meaning by going into darkness, by going into emptiness. In general, the role of darkness has probably not been sufficiently acknowledged in archaeological and historical literature, yet it's hugely apparent in the material record of our deep past. We see evidence of it when our ancestors secreted objects into another world through darkness, in natural and humanly made dark places. And conversely, it is in the retrieval of the hidden, such as hidden knowledge, when people remained in dark places in search of inner wisdom or enlightenment. Darkness as such is somehow fundamental to the human experience and to our search for meaning. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for listening.
That was amazing. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
Ask you about the 1930s electrification. You mentioned the shift in perception. What do you mean by that?
I don't know. I mean, he didn't elaborate on it too much, but it begins in 1946 and continues up to 64, I think. But even to some extent continued on into the 70s and later, I believe. John Moriarty himself is a kind of fascinating person. He lived, somewhat, by himself for many years in Connemara and later down in Kerry, and led a very simple life. He wrote with a pen. I visited his house once, and his table was a pile of books this high, and he'd have a piece of paper and he'd write with a pen. So he was somebody who had an extraordinarily kind of rich interior life, and probably, in terms of his level of sort of perception of things and realities, would have been in a very different place, certainly, than I am, So I think that's what he was referring to, those kind of experience he had or what he was aware of. So I think the sort of intense, electrification or brightening of the world, that something of the shadows or something hidden maybe was missed a little bit through that process. But yeah.
That makes sense. So it's just
Yeah.
this idea of dark has not light.
Yeah.
You've sort of flipped that on its head for me.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, yeah.
And of course, they're so entangled, you know, like it's really hard to talk about one subject without talking about the other, you know. Yeah.
Fascinating, thanks so much.
Yeah, no problem, you're very
Really enjoyed
welcome.
that.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
So I have a couple of questions, and that might give anyone else who has any questions a moment to think. The first one is, we were out last night on the Sligo walking tour, Dark Tales of Sligo, and one of the stories I hadn't realised was the story about the cemetery at St John's Cathedral, and that there was a story related to that the bodies that were buried there, like bog bodies, did not break down in the same way that bodies normally do, and that this was a sign of, if you like, some kind of supernatural experience. So that's one thing I wonder, you know, you were talking about people digging up bones to see if they'd been cleansed in order to calculate whether this person was now able to. And then the second one is, I'm wondering, and it's a broader question perhaps, but does the word comfort and darkness, do they appear anywhere together? The idea of comfort rather than, you know, a journey into the self or a soul-searching experience.
Yeah. I think both are correct. I think in general, you know, there was a great concern with bodies and what happened to bodies after death, and you can certainly see that in kind of practices and rituals. That story of St. John's. Another example, an excavation south of here in Roscommon some years ago. It was a churchyard, and just on the boundary of that churchyard there was a couple of burials found. Kind of, you may have heard of this one, Susan. And they had stones, quite large stones, that seemed to be forcibly placed in the mouths of the people. And of course the interpretation was that these people were somehow deviant or dangerous, maybe had done, you know, bad things in society, and people wanted to ensure that they couldn't reanimate the body. And this is why you've got these traditions from here to Romania, and fears about the deceased the body's not going away, you know. So that's a common theme. In terms of comfort and darkness, yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, I didn't talk about it too much, but you know, some people imagine when they go into places like caves that it would be very terrifying, and often what they get is the exact opposite experience. So, you know, I remember some years ago going into the Cave of the Cats, again in Roscommon, which was considered the entrance to hell in the Irish tradition of the underworld, you know. But when you go into a place like that, you actually feel very defended. You know, you have these, you know, walls either side of you. Your personal space is very secure. And like, you know, the example of the womb and so on, I think, you know, for many people, they find it deeply, deeply kind of comforting, a kind of softness and a reassurance of that kind of protective darkness. Yeah. So if we have no more questions, I'm going to thank Robert on behalf of those of you present and those of you online. Like with last night, we literally could have listened all day. It was really fascinating, really lovely journey. I know that that there's much more behind that, but it's a lovely journey, a lovely thought-provoking talk, Robert, and I feel much enriched by it on a Saturday morning. So thank you for taking part in our Samhain event, and we'll show our appreciation, and we look forward to the next time. And that concludes our online part of the Samhain event. Other events for the rest of the day will be in person. So thanks again to those of you who've joined us.